Thank you, Mr. Acting President. Now, I welcome anything that allows for greater ministerial and department oversight of VicForests. The Minister has assured me that this bill, if passed, it will not make it more difficult for environmental groups to take legal action against VicForests, and I very much hope that that is the case, because VicForest must be held accountable to the law and to this Parliament. Some of the problems with its past practices and behaviour have been well documented. So I do indeed hope that this bill will allow for greater ministerial and departmental oversight of this organisation without limiting the rights of concerned parties to pursue legal remedies. While I support an ethical and accountable forest timber harvesting industry, we need to rapidly move to plantation timber harvesting. Last year, in the Environment and Planning Committee inquiry into ecosystem decline, we heard the many concerns expressed by a number of witnesses around the serious damage being done to our ecosystem and endangered species by current native forest timber harvesting practices. Something of great significance, which I believe underlies the many problems which beset this industry, is our lack of tariffs on imported timber, which could be used to protect our local industry. There are many reasons why we should be discouraging the importation of certain forest timbers, which are often harvested and often illegally harvested in a manner which is having astoundingly harmful effects on the world's climate and ecology. The only way our local timber industry can compete with cheap imported timber is to clear fell whole areas of forest, young trees and old, and to use a good part of that harvest for wood chips, pulp and fibre, a lot of which is exported. This is not the selective harvesting we could encourage, which would give our forests a chance to exist as a habitat for all in a sustainable manner. Mr. Tom Crook of the East Gippsland Conservation Management Network gave the following evidence to the committee, and I quote, "It is supposed to be a sawlog industry, and there are certainly sawlogs coming out of the industry. But in terms of the revenue, the industry is extremely reliant on the revenue from the residual component or from the wood chipping part of it. So if you remove that, which you would, if you went to a selective-based model and you did not have all those other trees lying around that were not going to get turned into floorboards, then the industry would struggle to be economically viable. We are competing with countries who have invested more heavily in technology to make all sorts of dimensions of woods, laminated veneers and glulam and those technologies. We are competing with them, and with free trade agreements that will not let us impose tariffs to provide a market incentive to buy local products, then it's very difficult for our industry to compete without the revenue from pulp and fibre." End quote. In November 2019, the Victorian Government announced that 90,000 hectares of Victoria's remaining old-growth forest, note old growth, would be protected immediately. The Premier said the industry was not sustainable in the medium and long term. However, when this commitment was examined, there was one important proviso. This was that trees would have to be assessed prior to logging. Now, the Victorian National Park Association has raised serious concerns about this assessment process, especially the field assessments, which are conducted by VicForests or contractors. That, of course, is very concerning given VicForest's questionable record on conservation matters. The association, in a paper released in December 2020, said, and I quote, "Many large old trees, the most common defining characteristic of old-growth forest, are not protected in Victoria. Consequently, as a result of government policies, neither old-growth trees nor old-growth forests are properly protected in Victoria. While the Victorian Government has made big announcements about old growth, there are major flaws in old growth assessment and large tree protection. We urgently need to protect the old growth estate rather than creating new technical loopholes to allow its continued logging." End quote. Mr Crook of the East Gippsland Conservation Management Network also told the Environment and Planning Committee that where a tree was 80 to 120 years old, a very old tree, it was previously classified as a mature tree and therefore not counted as regrowth. He said the goalposts had been moved on what was classified as a mature tree, which has allowed greater access to areas which would have previously been excluded under the former old growth definition. Now, Mr President, it's obvious that the area of forestry is a particularly sensitive area for this government, and it's obvious because, as the Weekly Times reported on the 9th of February 2022, that long-term Labor loyalists had been appointed to key forestry policy and regulatory roles at the Department of Jobs, Precincts and Regions, as well as to roles at the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning. Only recently this House passed a notice of motion put by Mr Somyurek, which made mention of ALP activists stacked in the Victorian Public Service. This is completely contrary to the traditions of the Westminster system, and I would submit contrary to the interests of the Victorian public. Are Victorian forests being administered in the interests of the environment and the Victorian people, or are they being administered in the political interests of the Australian Labor Party and the current government? Whatever the answers are to these fascinating questions, Mr President, the need to end native timber harvesting and transition to plantation timber is extremely urgent. It should have been done decades ago, at least started on a broad-scale basis ages ago, especially if we continue down the unsustainable path of running an economy based on high population growth and the construction of housing which inevitably follows to accommodate these ever-growing numbers of people. Where is all the timber for this continual construction boom supposed to come from without destroying more of our environment? Part of the answer, I believe, is for the government to work much more closely with the private sector and landowners. The Environment and Planning Committee inquiry into ecosystem decline also heard some great evidence from the Otway Agroforestry Network about the work they are doing with farmers to grow more trees for harvest on their properties. Mr Andrew Stewart from the network told the committee that planting trees on farms helped increase biodiversity, and incentive for farmers to plant these trees was to use some of them for harvest timber. I believe the government needs to be working much more closely with groups like this to see how their success can be extended all across Victoria. Mr Rowan Reid from the network told the committee, and I quote, "As landholders, family farmers are going to be interested in a whole range of different things, but production has clearly got to be part of that scenario to make the farm viable. There is no reason why conservation could not also be a driver of profit through the use of native species as well." The Otway Agroforestry Network uses a farmer education program that we have developed and run around the world now, the Australian Master Tree Grower Program. We are really about informing and improving farmer decision-making about conservation initiatives. Just for our example, there are our two farms, but in the vicinity, the majority of farmers are now planting trees for some mixture of conservation and profit on their property, and the majority are funding these plantings themselves." End quote. And of course, the profit Mr Reid refers to comes from the harvesting of that timber. A bigger emphasis by the government on involving landholders in growing timber for profit and better biodiversity outcomes would be a good idea. There needs to be more partnerships with private landholders as we move away from native timber harvesting of our old growth forests. In conclusion, I'm supporting this bill because I accept the government's assurances that this bill will not reduce the ability of environmental groups to seek legal remedies for improper environmental practices, and I do take this matter very seriously. I expect the assurances I have received to be the case in practice and support the greater oversight and accountability of the VicForests organisation.
Thank you.